studio, eight s- backs backslash 18. Bravo aims for a radically different approach to game development. The video game industry has experienced tremendous change over the past several years. Massive studio closures, thousands of layoffs, ballooning development budgets, and increasingly lengthy production cycles have led many developers to question whether the traditional model of creating AAA games is still sustainable. Against that backdrop, a newly formed studio known as backslash 18. Bravo has announced its arrival with an ambitious goal to rethink how games are made from the ground up. Rather than following the same production methods used by many of the industry's largest developers, the studio says it wants to take what is described as a radically different approach to game development, one focused on agility, sustainability, and empowering smaller development teams. Although backslash 18. Bravo is still in its early stages, the studio's founders believe the industry has reached a turning point. Modern blockbuster games often require development teams of several hundred, or even more than 1,000, people with production schedules stretching 5 to 7 years before a title reaches players. Budgets have climbed into the hundreds of millions of dollars, creating enormous financial pressure on publishers. When a game fails to meet expectations, the consequences can be severe, resulting in layoffs, studio closures, canceled projects, and years of work disappearing overnight. According to the team behind backslash 18. Bravo, this cycle has become increasingly difficult to sustain both financially and creatively. Instead of pursuing larger and more expensive productions, backslash 18. Bravo says it wants to build games using smaller, highly experienced teams capable of making decisions quickly without layers of management slowing development. The studio argues that smaller teams can respond more effectively to creative ideas, adapt to player feedback more rapidly, and reduce many of the inefficiencies that often arise during massive productions involving hundreds of developers spread across multiple offices around the world. One of the studio's primary goals is to reduce unnecessary complexity throughout the development process. In recent years, many AAA games have become increasingly dependent on extensive planning documents, long approval chains, and rigid production pipelines that can make even small changes time consuming. Backslash 18. Bravo believes developers should spend less time navigating bureaucracy and more time building, testing, and proving games. By streamlining communication and giving developers greater ownership over their work, the studio happens to foster an environment where creativity can flourish without becoming bogged down by administrative overhead. Artificial intelligence is also expected to play a role in the studio's workflow, although the founders have emphasized that AI is intended to support developers rather than replace them. They believe modern AI tools can help automate repetitive production tasks, allowing artists, designers, programmers, and writers to focus on creative decision making instead of routine work. The studio has stressed that technology should enhance the abilities of development teams rather than diminish the importance of human creativity, which remains central to producing memorable games. Another area where backslash 18. Bravo hopes to distinguish itself is by embracing iterative development. Instead of spending years creating a game in isolation before revealing it to the public, the studio wants to involve players much earlier in the development process. Gathering community feedback throughout production could allow developers to identify problems sooner, refine gameplay systems based on real world experiences, and make meaningful improvements long before release. This philosophy had been successfully employed by many independent studios through early access programs, and backslash 18. Bravo believes similar ideas can benefit projects of various sizes. The studio also appears committed to creating a healthier working environment that for developers. Crunch has remained one of the gaming industry's most controversial issues. For decades, with employees at numerous companies describing long periods of mandatory overtime as projects approach release. While many major publishers have pledged to reduce crunch, excuse me, reports of excessive workloads continue to surface across the industry. By maintaining smaller teams, realistic project scopes, and more flexible production schedules, backslash 18. Bravo hopes to avoid many of the conditions that have historically contributed to developer burnout. The announcement arrives at a time where many developers are searching for new ways to make game development more sustainable. Since 2023, the industry has experienced widespread layoffs, affecting tens of thousands of employees across major publishers and independent studios alike. Companies including Microsoft, Sony, Electronic Arts, Ubisoft, Riot Games, Unity, and numerous others have reduced staff or restructured operations amid rising development costs and shifting market conditions. These challenges have prompted growing discussions about whether the traditional AAA production model needs to evolve. Industry veterans have increasingly argued that players do not necessarily demand bigger games. Instead, they often prioritize polished gameplay, compelling stories, stable performance, and meaningful innovation. Several critically acclaimed titles developed by relatively small teams have demonstrated that creativity and strong design can compete successfully with much larger productions. Games such as Balatro, Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, Animal Well, Dave the Diver, and Lethal Company have shown that modestly sized projects can capture enormous audiences without requiring blockbuster budgets. While //18.Bravo has not yet announced its debut project, the studio says it tends to prioritize originality over chasing established trends. Rather than building games around the latest market fad, whether battle royales, extraction shooters, or live service mechanics, the team wants to explore new gameplay ideas that emerge naturally from the creative process. The founders believe that innovation often becomes more difficult when development is driven primarily by financial expectations instead of experimentation. The studio's philosophy also reflects changing attitudes among players. Over the past several years, many gamers have expressed fatigue with increasingly large open world games requiring dozens or even hundreds of hours to complete. Instead, there has been renewed appreciation for focused experiences that respect players' time while delivering memorable gameplay. Smaller, more tightly designed games have frequently earned critical praise despite being developed with significantly fewer resources than traditional AAA titles. Of course, building a successful studio around these ideas will not be easy. Even smaller productions face significant challenges, including securing funding, attracting experienced talent, marketing games in a crowded marketplace, and competing for players' attention. While reducing team size may lower development cost, it also places greater responsibility on each individual developer. Success will ultimately depend not only on the studio's philosophy, but also on its ability to deliver games that resonate with audiences. Even so, //18.Bravo's announcement highlights an important conversation taking place throughout the gaming industry. As budgets continue to rise and development timelines grow longer, more studios are exploring alternative ways of creating games that balance creativity, financial sustainability, and developer well being. Whether those efforts involve smaller teams, new technologies, earlier community involvement, or more flexible production methods, many developers believe meaningful change is necessary if the industry hopes to avoid repeating the cycle of layoffs and studio closures that has defined recent years. For now, //18.Bravo remains a new name with ambitious goals rather than a proven track record. However, its willingness to challenge long established development practices had already attracted attention from developers and players alike. If the studio succeeds in turning its philosophy into successful games, it could become an example of how the next generation of game development looks. Not by building bigger games, but with more people, but by not by building bigger games with more people, but by creating smarter games with empowered teams and renewed focus on creativity. As the industry continues searching for a more sustainable future, many will be watching closely to see whether //18.Bravo's radically different approach can deliver on its ambitious vision. Yeah. So what I have to say about that is, first, it's independent studio, and I think any independent or small gaming studio that wants to enter game development, thank you. Uh, and a lot of what they said could also be applied to Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League that I read about in the first story. They're not. They just said they're not chasing trends. They're not going after battle royale. They're not going after live extraction shooters. They could create the games that allow them to feel to be creative. They also said, yes, we will use AI, but not to replace people, just to do repetitive tasks so we can spend more time in the creative process. How you feel about that will vary. I know some of you are going to hate that. Um, so, but I mean, they did say that yeah, AI will be used to handle repetitive routine tasks. So, what that looks like and what they consider AI to handle, we won't know until we see their first game. But it sounds like, at least in theory, this company gets it. This company gets why certain games fail. This company gets why this company gets why game companies fail, why games like Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League failed. So yeah, I can't wait to see their first project. And they said basically we want to show that games, with a dedicated team can still be fun. So, you know, until there's really nothing more to say about that until we hear their first game. But at least far as their theory goes, at least their theory sounds good on paper. It just now all comes to execution.